points for today. Firstly, why this never really works. Secondly, why this makes civil organizations more ineffective. And thirdly, how this increasingly harms the citizens. First things to note in setup. What do these civil organizations look like? Obviously, these look like non-government organizations or charity organizations. And I'll note it's important that they're non-government because noting that the South Korean government has their own agenda, things like not aggravating North Korea to improve relations for the sake of security of their own citizens. That's important to say because these civil organizations often act counterintuitively to South Korean operations. And the government in South Korea hasn't stopped these actions by civil organizations, firstly, because that seems like a big impeding on the democracy within South Korea. It also looks like stopping it also just looks really bad given the stake that South Korean citizens have to the proximity to North Korean relations, but also because it is hard to stop because these civil organizations are quite decentralized and it's legally very hard to stop very small scale things like smuggling. We only need like 10 people and some money to be able to do that. Let's then talk about why this thing never really works and why you'll never really be able to claim any benefits to these North Korean people. First thing to know, North Korea has a lot of structural control over their country. That is to say, they are an autocracy, so very little bureaucracy or impediment on capacity to do state action against these sort of things, but also because they've had time to build up their kingdom of isolation. Things like building up borders and the security around that to be able to stop anything coming in. Things like having a very interconnected and very proficient and efficient security system inside to make sure they can quell or torture or kill anyone that seems like they are connected to the outside world. Compare all of that capacity with the capacity of these civil organizations, which I've already told you are largely small, are largely decentralized, don't have essentially a hive-minded organization to be able to carry this out particularly effectively compared to the North Korean government. The second thing to note, the North Korean government has a strong incentive, even at the cost of things like productivity. That is to say, the only thing in their perception that can stop this regime is civilian rebellion. So they constantly need to protect the cult of personality that they view as fragile. Because they have been in power for so long, because they know it could potentially topple, they need to consistently and constantly bolster their ideology. That is something that is perceived as incredibly important to them. So that is to say, even if this information doesn't do much, the perceived threat, even if it does nothing, they will stop at nothing to quell this, to stop this. The third thing to state is even if this information is able to get in, the people can't engage. Why is this? 3 reasons. Firstly, education is controlled by government. Necessarily, this hampers their capacity to comprehend things. Because of the level of education that these people receive, because they're often in communities that don't receive a lot of funding, a state funding to get a good amount of education. Things like ideology hampering the way they're able to perceive the fact they receive. Things like their capacity to process how bad the regime is. Things like the capacity to process the trade-offs they make versus poverty versus their great leader protecting them and saving them from the evil, malicious West. That means any information about how to reach out, how to get out of the country, how to stop and rebel, all is quite useless for these people because they don't really know how to action it. The second thing to state is even if these people know how to comprehend it, they are very strong because the cult of personality, contrary to North Korean government's perception, is very strong. That is to say, if they see a foreign balloon land in their village, they don't want to risk association because they know their family could be raped, pillaged, and murdered by all the security guards that will swarm their village as soon as they hear wind of rebellion or foreign presence within the village. But the third thing to state is capacity. Things like USB, DVDs, airwaves, that all requires things to boot that up and get them to work. Note that this stuff often has to get through to the border because the center is often a hub of security action. Unclear how they're able to infiltrate so far. And oftentimes this role of the community will be quite difficult because obviously they will be killed and they are likely have low education, but also they don't have shit to be able to work this technology. All of this to say, this explains why the amount of cases where the benefit works is small, but it's hard to demonstrate any evidence of this working. So they can never claim that the organizations can adapt to maneuvers and they can't actually get more strategic. So you're always going to be throwing shit at the wall and that shit will never actually be able to accrue into any improvement whatsoever. They never can claim any progress in that regard. But how does this actually make civil organizations more effective? Couple things to note. There is an opportunity cost when these civil organizations engage in this action because they rely on donations, on time, on volunteers. Their goal should be to expand and help more North Korean refugees, to help the people that need the most help. Why is it then that these civil organizations become more ineffective? Firstly, because obviously this is very risky activity. Things like smuggling result in death. That is to say, if a person gets caught trying to drop something in at the border, at the line, that means they can die, they can get shot, they can get kidnapped and be held hostage. And that means you lose people, you lose connections in North Korea that are vital to helping people get out, you lose resources that have been spent on getting stuff in. That is incredibly harmful because that is the trade-off, that is the opportunity cost. But secondly, it is things like backlash. Things like you've depleted resources, people are unclear where their donations have gone because you sucked it into this black hole that hasn't really yielded much progress. That means the people willing to join your organization go down. When you send over balloons full of information and North Korea shoots them down and sends shit balloons over back to South Korea, that means you lessen the critical mass in these organizations because nobody wants to join when you've engendered such backlash and you've worsened relations with North Korea more and harmed the security of your nation. Note that we're able to claim this that opportunity cost. Given that opportunity cost, the capital could go somewhere more effective. Things like helping North Korean refugees get rehomed in places like China, Japan, Uzbekistan, giving them visas that are quite expensive, giving them homes, giving them education. Noting then that these benefits are very certain, and they're also safer. They rely less on you going into the regime that is very well guarded, and it also means that you're able to track your progress and get more donations. And this is quite a likely thing you can spend your money on because the goal is the same, to help people. And this harm is quite bad because noting that these organizations already have limited capacity, when you hamper this capacity even more, it means you lose out massively on your ability to help the people who need it the most, help the people who want to be able to get out and escape their hellish lives in a regime that is killing them. The last thing to state, I think this leads nicely to my last point, which is the stuff on how you harm citizens by engaging in this kind of action. Noting the context that I gave you about the regime being very scared of losing power, any amount of perceived civil disobedience is cracked down on massively. Noting also the state power. They have lots of capacity and the impunity to crack down. Things like pillaging a small farming village. Things like looting a village just because they think that there's a foreign presence within there. Things like killing entire families and generations just because they slightly have a connection to the outside where something might get infiltrated and might get in. Noting then that the reason they don't do this without this action or with these balloons coming in is because it harms productivity, things like farms, things like villages. This is specifically a tipping point to encourage them to crack down, to encourage them to engage in violent action that harms these citizens. So why do they do it? Firstly, any person suspected of connection gets tortured, they get shot. That's to scare the people around them. That's to punish them for their perceived disobedience against the huge regime, the regime that ought to rule over all. And they threaten people, they scare them, they destabilize huge communities, they ruin lives, they kill people. That's a huge harm they have to stand by. But the second thing is the state knows, given that the state knows that these balloons are coming in this far more than the status quo, they'll be incentivized to lean more into propaganda. They will solidify and keep pushing agendas to the populace. That means any other attempts in the future to try and destabilize the regime are always going to be far harder, given that the North Korean government is now incentivized to consolidate all of that. Noting then that these certain harms that accrue to the most vulnerable people on the ground who now have to suffer from the crackdowns, who now have to suffer from their farms being burned down, from their crops being pillaged, from all their cattle and their herds being shot because they are perceived to have been a broken chain in the link of the North Korean government, proud to affirm.
All right, thanks First Affirmative for that speech. Now welcome First Negative. And just checking, do you consent to recording?
No thanks.
Three things, starting with their claims on the South Koreans benefiting, because notice this was very, very vague and hinged on you feeling catharsis. Two things. Firstly, notice catharsis is not symmetric to the kinds of actions they're able to take. Any kinds of actions to help people are cathartic. We posit that our actions are actually more cathartic. For example, being able to help someone get a home, being able to help someone get a visa, being able to pull someone out of the river after they actually descend. We told you these things did come at a trade-off. It is unclear to us why they don't, insofar as capital is probably limited. But secondly, I want to point out that the kinds of actions they're talking about, for example, yelling from a speaker or sending balloons, if they want to tell us they're small and not resource intensive, they also have to claim the trade-off on the effectiveness of those actions. Because notice here that if you blast over the speaker, the only people who are able to hear that are people proximal to the border next to where you place that speaker. Notice here, the North Korean military stands by the border where those speakers are. Notice here, that probably means very few people hear it. Okay, you send balloons. How far do those fucking balloons travel? Judy tells you they won't travel very far. And the
people they travel to are the least educated people. It's people who are the most terrified of the foreign balloon traveling into your town because you've never seen a balloon. Because where the fuck are you buying a balloon in North Korea in the middle of the forest? Very unlikely that any of their impacts are able to manifest. If they do manifest, they have to claim the trade-off of either you spend lots and lots of money or you get very, very little effect. I don't understand why it's reasonable. The second claim on South Korea is that obviously you're not self-defeating and you don't think this is good, this is giving you catharsis, and obviously this trade-off doesn't exist because people in South Korea are very, very rich, richer than the North Korean government. Firstly, I don't understand why people in South Korea, the richest people, are the ones who are buying into this and have the incentive to actually get this money. No structural analysis given to us here. But secondly, notice the North Korean government does have money. They have money that they particularly allocate towards its military expenditures. They have years of these regimes being set up. It is not a matter of them having to funnel lots and lots more money. We tell you, even if they aren't funneling more money, they already have the existing structures in place. But secondly, notice this is the top of their priority list. So even if you believe they have little money, the money they do have is going into stopping this because this is an existential threat to their regime, because they tell us it's risking revolution. Obviously, if it's risking revolution, they care about it very, very highly. Okay, two things then. First on efficacy, then on North Koreans. On efficacy, their main claims here are twofold. Firstly, you have the capacity to do this, and secondly, you know it's bad for the people to lack information, and they're very curious, therefore they will buy into it. A few things. Firstly, I flagged to you already why your efficacy is limited at the point at which these regimes stand. They give us very little response to the structural reasons Judy gives you as to why it's very, very difficult for this information to actually get in the first place. We tell you the balloons are shot down, to no response. We tell you the speakers are placed proximally quite far from these people, no response. We tell you the radio waves can only be interpreted by people who have access to radios and USB players. No response as to why the rural places where this information is likely to reach have the capacity to interpret this or access it or do anything about it. But thirdly, no structural response to the fact that we told you that people are terrified of this. All of their mechanisms on efficacy are reliant on people not being scared of this and actually buying into it in the first place. They had two main things to say as to why people do this. The first was people are curious. Very little nuance here. And the second was people are just aren't scared they're going to be killed because you get plausible deniability. A few things to say. Firstly, you are scared because notice North Korea has an empirical record of cracking down on these things. Why do they structurally want to crack down on this? Firstly, because it's a slippery slope. The way you entrench your power and make sure people don't act up is when anyone acts up, you crack down on it harsh. If one person in a village is seen with a balloon and you kill their family, no one else is ever seen with a village. Unless they can explain to us why North Korea doesn't have an incentive to crack down on these kinds of things, I think we're able to claim those benefits insofar as we tell you why. You empirically know why. The average reasonable voter knows why North Korea wants to stop all these things. But the second reason here, on plausible deniability, notice you need action from both sides of the house in order for this to work. You can't just have the South Koreans sending a balloon in. Someone in North Korea needs to open that balloon. You can't just have a USB being smuggled in without a North Korean handing that USB to someone else. That means North Koreans are involved. Insofar as the government has the incentive to track this down and end it, they have an incentive to blackmail, to torture, to get the information so they can break down the links to stop the smuggling happening in the future. That just means that plausible deniability isn't enough, because maybe the balloon landed in your village. Why were you opening that balloon in the first place? Also, just notice here on detectability. They said you can't hear the speaker or you can't see the balloon. Obviously, you have border security. You have things like sensors and cameras around your borders seeing what foreign fucking elements are flying into your country. No structural reason as to why that doesn't exist. I think you ought to believe us and the 4 minutes of analysis Judy gives you as to why this happens. Their final claim here is that people are perceptive and curious. Firstly, if you believe that people are already curious and already want to dissent and already have the capacity to do this, notice these are not the people for whom the margin of change is different. Because what is the additional information they're able to give you? Like your family member's name? I think it only applies to people who are able to dissent. The impact we're able to give you with that capital allocation is probably far larger because of higher likelihood of them actually staying alive on our side of the house. But secondly, notice the information that potentially you give has to be able to be acted upon. For example, if you're telling people like the location of somewhere they can get to, and they try to get there and they die, as a South Korean smuggling information in, obviously you have a smaller understanding of North Korean terrain than the North Koreans actually do. That just means you're at an information deficit here, which means the North Korean military obviously has the strategic power in being able to shut you down. But finally, In order for you to believe their claims, you have to believe the margin of impact people are able to claim from this information is larger than the guaranteed risk of some people dying, of some people's families being pillaged, of some people being tortured for years and years in concentration camps. That is a guaranteed harm on the most vulnerable people. You ought to care about that more. Finally, let's talk about what their claims were on the North Korean people. They said you're better off and they're going to kill you anyway. Once again, I want to notice the lack of nuance in this analysis, the lack of contextual information they give us. Why don't we just kill you for anything and they kill you more on our side, on their side of the house? Firstly, notice you don't have an incentive to kill people for no reason because they're productive generally. You do have an incentive though to kill them in the instances where you believe they will have a ripple-on effect when they are going to be talking about what they heard on the speaker. If you are a factory military security guard and you hear your workers talking about what they heard on the speakerphone, you care about your job, you are responsible if those people descend, you save your life and you snitch on them because everyone must fight for themselves in a world where everyone is fucking starving. That is a reason why, from the top to the bottom, people who engage with this die, people who don't engage with this have an incentive to snitch on the ones who do. That is structural. The second reason why we think it's particularly bad is tell us, well, the pamphlets were sent into Germany. What did the Nazis do with those pamphlets? They used them as toilet paper, just like the Koreans use the balloons. They shit in them and they throw them back to South Korea. I'm going to finally bring back the material we give you at Judy, which was largely ignored on why South Korean forces become worse. We tell you firstly, people become scared. Tell us it's not that risky to play on a speakerphone. Firstly, notice the trade-off here. If playing on a speakerphone impacts slower. But secondly, let's take them at their best. Notice here that the South Koreans are expending a massive amount of money and resources on this. If you are a rich person, you want effective altruism, you want to see something actually coming out of this. If your USBs are being sent in, or the North Korean government is actually taking action to speak out against the things you are doing, clearly that shows your altruism isn't as effective. It means you're likely to put less money in. But also notice, in our worst case scenario, the more extreme of an action you are doing, the less likely people are to buy in. Because the rhetoric is you are scared of the North Korean government, you know the North Korean government is quite strict, you don't want to risk your own family being killed and pillaged. I think all that means capital goes down, engagement goes down, you fuck over North Koreans. Thank you.
Alright, thanks, second affirmative. Now welcoming second negative. Second negative, do you consent for recording? Or?
Yeah.
Three things in this speech. First off, on advocacy. Secondly, on North Korean citizens. And then finally, on civil organizations and why catharsis is the most important thing for them. First off, on advocacy. They give us a number of claims that try to explain why this doesn't work. I'm going to go through each of them and respond. The first thing that they tell us is that the capacity of North Korea is far greater than that of a civil organization. Obviously, a country is richer than a civil organization, but the key thing to note here is that even if they have more nukes and money, obviously these resources can't be used towards every single purpose. That is to say, just because North Korea has more nukes and money doesn't necessarily mean that a civil organization's radio is going to be suppressed. They can't automatically block everyone's ears and stuff like that. They have a limited amount of land. They can't shepherd everyone so incredibly far away. So I don't exactly see how this is necessarily specifically applicable within this situation. But the other thing to note as well is I think civil organizations oftentimes are incredibly insulated from North Korea. That just looks like the fact that they're geographically based within South Korea, so it is incredibly hard to actually latch onto this organization and take them down in any sort of meaningful way. Obviously, South Korea has incentive to try and protect its own citizens and economic resources as well. Second thing that they tell us is that North Korea takes this threat seriously. First off, as I noted beforehand, obviously they do not prove that North Korea can take serious action in order to actually suppress the information sharing that is undertaken by these civil organizations. But secondly, I would note that perhaps even if all of this is true, perhaps it is good if this distracts the regime from harming their citizens. Like presumably this takes up like a couple of days' work of a couple of soldiers. Maybe this means that they can't shoot as many North Korean citizens as they otherwise would be able to. I would argue that that is actually quite a substantial benefit on our side as well. The next thing that they tell us then is that even if all of this happens, the North Korean people cannot physically access this information. I'm just going to do like a couple of things that I think quite creatively these civil organizations perhaps could do. Maybe they can go in different areas at different times. Obviously, you don't have enough soldiers to put across the entire country. North Korea is incredibly ineffective because it's an autocracy. Their soldiers aren't incredibly happy or are incredibly like inflamed about trying to do these sorts of things. Maybe we can just make our speakers louder or just put a lot of them there. Perhaps we can target North Korea from the Chinese border. I don't know, I think civil organizations are probably really good at this. They've been doing this for like hundreds or like 50 of years, so on and so forth. But the final thing to note as well, even if we just get a couple of people, I think people care about other people as well. I would argue that communities within these sorts of countries are oftentimes the strongest because there is nobody else to rely on. You cannot rely on your government. You must rely on your community to help you and support you in your time of need. So I think what this means is that even if just a couple of people get USBs, this inflames people to actually talk about it with other sorts of people. They know that this is going to be perfectly fine to talk about now and that nobody else is going to snitch on them because it is such valuable information. The next claim that we hear then is that people cannot engage for a couple of reasons. They tell us first off that education is controlled, which means that this is really hard to go through. We tell you at Zoe that there are just so many bad things constantly happening around them. That just looks like the fact that the quality of life is incredibly bad. You do see people dying of incredibly preventable medical illnesses, or otherwise you just do see the fact that famine is occurring right now, or just people are disappearing by the generations, so on and so forth, as they depict. And this information is directly relevant to this and directly explains this, so obviously incredibly good. Next thing that they say then is that they fear crackdown, so they won't access this information. First off, I would argue that in a lot of the situations that we talk about, you can't not engage because it's incredibly sudden and right in your face. You can't close your ear holes all of a sudden, or you can't close your eyes and try and walk around blind in a sea of fires and stuff like that. I would argue that a lot of this information just has to be absorbed, and I think people are really good at designing flyers. You can make the font big or bold or something like that. But secondly, we tell you that they are incredibly curious. There is a profound lack of information within North Korea. I think people are incredibly smart. Even if you have had propaganda shoved down your throat constantly, I think you can understand that perhaps there is more to life than just worshipping Kim Jong-un. The other thing to note as well is the precise nature of this curiosity. That is to say, there are existential threats to your life presently. You are constantly fearing the idea that these soldiers might come into your house and shoot you at any moment. You do want some sort of explanation for this. And that is the reason why curiosity under our side is far greater. They tell us that if you are curious, you will access this anyway. But the key thing to note here is that there's an asymmetry in terms of what people want and what is actually accessible within these sorts of countries. That is to say, for example, if you're a smuggler that smuggles things from South Korea into North Korea, you probably take not things like political information about how bad the regime is, but instead things like K-dramas and stuff like that, because it's still profitable, but it doesn't get you killed if you are caught with it. So I think what this means is that this is uniquely the only way to actually get this information across. I think it's worth it. Other responses here, I think you can present really easy excuses. You can be like, oh, I wasn't reading this flyer, I was just going to go burn it in the fire and stuff like that. And I would argue that even if all of this isn't true, this ultimately does help hide people that are smuggling in foreign goods, or otherwise other sorts of people as well, that perhaps spy operatives and stuff like that, which is an incredibly large benefit. Finally, they tell you that you can't action it even if you get the information because you don't know how to get out. But we tell you an incredibly large lower scale of actions that also exist that you can participate in. That, for example, looks like not assisting the regime that kills people around you. Maybe you're just a little bit slower at your admin work and sending the email that determines who's doing what and so on and so forth. But finally, even if all of this is true and they can't do anything, I would argue that the information in of itself is incredibly good. You do deserve to have a chance to understand the truth no matter what you do with it. There is no other media source that exists within these sorts of countries. They do believe to know the truth. So, moving on then to what happens to citizens. They claim that this harms citizens because you're likely to loot villages and kill generations because of slight suspicion, and they argue that you would the regime wouldn't do this without this particular policy because they need their citizens to be incredibly productive. The key thing to note here, and I don't think this is contentious at all from both teams' cases, is that life is already so incredibly bad in North Korea. Famine is ongoing, people die at incredibly high rates, the life expectancy is 40 years or something like that. And the specific reason why the regime does this is because this is the way to keep people somewhat compliant. You need to something to dangle above their heads, or you need to ensure that they aren't healthy and fit in enough to like rise up in a revolution or stuff like that. You need to keep them willing to believe your propaganda. What this means then is that there is no like tipping point here. You cannot make this like any worse under their side. So I would argue that this is perfectly fine. The next thing then is that specifically the North Korean people who are smuggling get caught. First off, I would suggest that they smuggle goods anyway. There's a massive black market within North Korea. Secondly, perhaps they're just good at smuggling because they're like really practice within this. You can just take advantage. These civil organizations can just take advantage of existing channels. But finally, yeah, that's all there. Okay, moving on to civil organizations. What do we hear first from the Affirmative team? First thing that they tell us is that in the comparative, they can help more defectors and things like that. First off, I would argue that these organizations are generally well-funded and well-populated. Because South Koreans are incredibly invested in this issue, they do see things like really sympathetic depictions of North Korean suffering. They kind of just have an idea of what's going on, or otherwise have really personal investments within these sorts of issues. For example, they have family members they were separated with during the war, or otherwise like are defectors in of themselves and stuff like that. But the other thing I want to note as well is I don't know where all of this surplus of defectors that they want to help is coming from. Like, I think there's just such an incredibly small number. They already are helped under either side. I would argue that civil organizations probably prioritize helping them, given that this is kind of their main thing. And if you have somebody that is unhoused, that is a North Korean defector, I think that that is something that you care about. In fact, I would suggest on our side, what we want to do is perhaps increase the number of defectors that want to make this decision. Then what these organizations are able to do is show that there is a need for donations and show their own successes, which means they're likely to increase the amount of money that they have. The next thing that they tell us then is that these are incredibly risky activities and is a waste of resources for these civil organizations. First off, this is already happening and has been happening for a really long time. There's not much risk because you can do this from long range areas, or otherwise do the guerrilla tactics that I told you about earlier. But secondly, I would argue that North Korea doesn't want to inflame South Korea massively as well, because obviously it is an incredibly powerful nation, even though it's a little bit irrational at times. It doesn't want to irrationally create a war under different circumstances, so it wouldn't do things like kidnapping South Koreans. So I think this is perfectly fine.
Alright, thanks, second negative. Now welcoming third affirmative. And sorry, do you consent to recording?
Yeah, that's fine. Firstly, on what is certain in this debate, and then secondly, on what is not certain. The first thing that is certain is that North Korea stops at nothing to stop this info from getting in, and punishes anyone even suspected of having it, or even suspected of being near it, which is why these balloons don't get to people in the first place, because they literally move the whole town, or they don't allow people to build near it. Or if there's a town suspected of hospiting USBs, then what they do is they kidnap someone from the town, they torture families suspected of doing it, especially rural communities which have no power to fight back, which have very little political capital, and which Kim Jong-un gives no shits about. This is the most disgusting thing that North Korea does to its people. It's also the most proximate harm to people's life, because that's additional years of torture. That is your family being lit on fire. That is your crops being stolen and with no compensation, and your family being left to starve and to be destitute. That is you not having access to state medical care because they deem you as untrustworthy, they deem you as a traitor, they deem you as too suspicious of the regime, you get no education, that ruins your fucking life. What did they say in response to this? The first thing they say is that North Korea is poor and therefore can't outcompete a very rich South Korea. A, this is obviously not true. North Korea builds nuclear weapons despite being a very poor nation. Obviously you believe it has the capacity to do things like scout from USBs. But the other thing to say here is obviously its budget is poor relative to South Korea. It makes less money. But the amount of money it spends on the military, the amount of money it spends on doing these kinds of things in order to protect its cultural personality, in order to protect the security of the state, in order to guard against the kinds of revolution which this negative team posits as possible perhaps, that is the thing North Korea is scared of. That's why they spend money even though they might not have it or have a lot of it. B, obviously, obviously their donations material, we preempt this and explain why many South Koreans aren't against this practice because they're scared that antagonizes the North Korean government, which explains explains why these organizations are often small, often don't have a lot of money, and they don't get funding from the South Korean government, because the South Korean government wants to be seen as independent, wants to improve relations with North Korea, as happened in the South Korean Olympics, as happened at the recent summit under the Trump organization. Second thing they say here is you don't need a lot of money for a large speaker. A, I posit whether this is actually true. Some really large speakers do cost a lot of money. But B, it's about the trade-off and the effectiveness of it. You can buy a large speaker at a very cheap cost, but if you could get a North Korean person a visa or an easier escape route out of China, that is a far easier way to actually help people. But C, obviously the best case expensive, right? It's navigating around North Korean military. It's doing things like sending USBs. It's doing things like paying North Koreans to deliver along supply chains, which obviously is very risky and therefore would demand a very high price for it, which explains why their best case, where the things they actually get a benefit from, rather than going giving a balloon to North Korea, which then they shoot down at the border, explains why it is expensive. 3, they already say it's a shit regime and therefore it can't get worse. This would be a good point, except we explain that obviously it can get worse, and you intuitively believe this. Because of the cruelty of the North Korean regime, we explain that under our side of the house, where they're not as threatened, where they're not as scared of towns potentially defecting or information hiding underneath the government, then they focus on more economical things, they focus on more rational things, like the productivity of that regime, which is why they steal crops under their side, but they don't under our side. Or they don't focus on harming the people, because they don't want the people to actually be suffering, because they want to convince them of that of like living in a dream paradise, which explains why on their side that's a tipping point, but on our side why it's far better. But obviously, okay, I think I've doubted this, but B, obviously it's the additionality of harm, the additional person in your family getting kidnapped, the additional years of torture which you might be subjected to, the additional times that the North Korean troops go to your local village and take your crops without pay, is the additional harm which they stand by, is their livelihoods. It is disgusting. The fourth thing they say here is the balloons will distract them from torturing their citizens, and that's really beneficial. A, what the fuck? This is obviously not true. But B, the amount of resources they spend on this is something that they take out of things that benefit the citizens, right? Because obviously they're not going to decrease their propaganda budget, because that is the core of the state, right? So they decrease things like subsidizing farmers, they decrease their healthcare, they decrease the ability to make their citizens' lives better, because that's the things that they can sacrifice, the elites are willing to sacrifice. It is the things that make their lives worse, it is the things that this team perpetuates. Then they say, oh, well, it doesn't actually make it worse because you have plausible deniability. It's if they never explain why the North Korean officials care about that, and I think they don't, because obviously they want to protect their fucking regime, right? Which explains why plausible deniability is a Western legal concept and not in the courts of North Korea, because they don't have any, and the soldiers probably don't understand it. 6, they say they're good at their job because they've been doing it for 50 years. This is only mitigatory, but obviously the North Korean government knows this, and therefore that is an additional reason why they crack down more, additional reason why they fund the military instead of funding other things. Obviously that's really beneficial for us when we decrease that. The second thing we explain, which is certain, is that the trade-off is far more certain benefits, like giving them a visa, like creating more asylum paths, which we can do because the motion is about information that is spread to North Koreans, and the additional boats that you get for refugees out of North Korea, the additional houses that you're able to build for North Korean refugees, the additional ad campaigns that you're able to do to inform South Koreans about how bad the North Korean government is, the additional advocacy that you can pay for, like to pressure the other foreign governments, like the US government for more sanctioned North Korean officials, is the certain trade-off, is the trade-off that is far less proximate to the North Korean government because it's not happening under their own nose, and is far more able to be carried out because you're not being thwarted in your own country of South Korea, which they concede at second. The third thing we get, which is certain in this debate, is that they harm the capacity of these organizations. They just assert that they don't kidnap South Koreans, but that's obviously not true. I'm sure you've heard stories of South Korean activists getting kidnapped. A very famous South Korean movie makers have been kidnapped. I'm sure they're willing to torture or kidnap or do horrible things to the people in these organizations, which explain, but also the fact that they harm these organizations because many South Koreans see the nuclear test that North Korea is doing and blame these civil organizations because they are the ones who is directly antagonizing the government, which explains why they decrease the donations to these organizations of their side pass, they increase the kidnappings, they increase the ability for people to not want to work with the regime, but also at the point where they sneak things into, they create supply chains in North Korea, and then that one supply chain gets destroyed, that is a person in jail, that is a person person who can no longer work for you, that doesn't happen or happens far less to a degree in South Korea. Let's talk about what is uncertain. The first thing they say is that people will engage with it, and they give a series of unintuitive reasons. The first is they say they know how bad the regime is, but obviously this isn't true, because North Korean television, which is the only access to media most people have, tells them that they live in great wealth compared to the West. So sure, they might know how bad their personal situation is, but they often don't know how bad relative it is to the rest of the world, so that's really powerful at that side of the debate. Then they say they have a revealed preference for not liking the regime because many people defect. This is a small amount of people, but obviously it's way less likely compared to what nuanced reasoning we give you, is the different ways the North Korean government infiltrates its people. It teaches them from young ages. It controls their state media. It controls the ways in which they speak. Obviously it is far more proximate to these individuals. Then they say they're not brainwashed, they're smart. Obviously that's not true, you don't believe that. But then they say, oh, well, these organizations in South Korea aren't demonized by the North Korean people. It's the South Korean government. But obviously they see everything as the West, right? And so obviously the organizations of government are seen as the same. Then they say, oh, well, people had a curiosity. I think we dealt with this because fear is a far more controller than curiosity. Okay, so then they say disobedience. We deal with this. We flip it, explain why it's a harm, increases the torture of people. We deal with the most certain harms in this debate, the more certain benefits that we get, and that is why we win.
Alright, thanks to the affirmative. Now we'll do third negative to conclude the substantive portion of the debate. Third negative, you consent to recording?
Yes. This affirmative team imagines the North Korean state in the same way Hollywood movie studios do. You don't and cannot move entire towns. It is massively expensive. The North Korean state is poor. And also, most of North Korea's economy is agricultural. Like, you have to exist in certain areas because that is where you grow the food that the state is dependent upon. You also don't and cannot murder every single person living near a river that has pamphlets flowing in it, because you need workers, you need people to work on the fields, you need a population to exist. But also, that's just the quickest way to get a revolution, to, without any care, go into a town and murder every single person. That is the quickest way to make sure that every person in that state hates you, is not only afraid of you, but realizes that they'll die anyway, so they might as well fight against you while they have the chance. I'll do two things in this speech. Firstly, I'll prove that we're better for people in North Korea, and then I'll prove we're better for people in South Korea. Let's just start with North Koreans. And the first question I'll ask is, will this communication work? And the first, qualm they give is that we cannot afford this. And this is two problems. There are two problems with the argument. The first is just that it's divorced from reality, right? Like, it already exists. The motion implies that, like, empirically, there are pamphlets being flown to North Koreans, there are speakers on the border. So you should already believe that they have the money to put this infrastructure in place. But secondly, as we explained at Huang to no response, these civil organizations are often massively funded for the reason that it's politically popular. And they can see this first affirmative where they're like, the South Korean government doesn't want to interfere because people are so obsessed with the cause. Yes, people are obsessed with the cause. They're willing to give money to the cause because their family are across the border, because they know how bad the North Korean state is and they want to do something about it. The second thing they say is North Korea is dictatorial and isolationist, so they just won't let this happen. Two responses to this. Firstly, it is divorced from the world that we live in. No amount of power can stop speakers from existing on the South Korean border, for the reason that if you shoot them down, that is like an act of war. You are sending your military across the border. Obviously, North Korea doesn't want to do that. You also, sure, maybe you have fighter jets, but you cannot blow up an entire river that has pamphlets flowing down it. They're like, entire towns exist away from borders and speakers, so they don't get this information. Sure, maybe they don't get information, but we don't have to prove that every single North Korean citizen now has access to information, just that some do. They're also like, you'll just shoot down the balloons. But our claim is that if you have to waste military infrastructure shooting down balloons, that is maybe a benefit. Or if you have to waste, military personnel's time walking across the border, that is again maybe a benefit because they are wasting their time doing that and not pillaging the communities that they talk about onto their side, not going in and ravaging and killing people, without any mercy, things like that. Cool. The final thing I'll suggest is that I think this motion implies just attempts. Like, the organization can just decide when it would and wouldn't be useful. If it is the case that North Korea is now suddenly shooting down speakers, they will not use speakers. If it is the case that now they're putting heaps of money into shooting down balloons, they will not use balloons. Like, it is crazy for this, and I think paternalistic for this affirmative team to suggest that they know more about the context than civil organizations operating within them. Like, obviously they will just do things that are efficacious for all of the financial reasons they identify. The next claim they make is North Korea has the incentive to execute absolute domestic control. So they'll crack down and they'll kill people and they'll ravage communities. Two responses. Firstly, we preempt this by explaining that now people have a massive amount of plausible deniability. Their claim requires you to believe that now North Korea will kill everyone who listens to a speaker or everyone who exists near a river that has pamphlets going through them. But obviously you cannot annihilate entire populations because that destroys the function of the state, right? Like Kim Jong-un and his advisors need food, so you need people to make the food. You cannot get rid of entire agricultural communities who, do that. Then they're like, even if you don't kill everyone within the community, you can just find the individual who opened the balloon, which is firstly an insane claim. Like these balloons don't fall and then you don't open them and then scavenge the pamphlets everywhere. That would be a silly way to do it. But secondly, even if it is the case that an individual does have to open it, it is surely good to give that person the choice, allow them to have the ability to go and spread that information if they want. Yes, maybe they died, but at least we give them some agency under our side to access some information. We're not putting a gun to their head and making them do it. Secondly, I'm just genuinely unsure about how things can get worse for these people. The context that this affirmative team identifies is that violence is everywhere. The North Korean state just does whatever they want. The only justification they give is they are very cruel. But again, we explain that you cannot just move entire towns, you cannot kill entire populations without losing your control as the state. Instead, we flip this argument at Zoe to no response, which is that now you have the incentive to be less punitive for the reason that you want to go against the rhetoric and the propaganda, right? Like if the propaganda is saying the North Korean state will kill you if you do anything, you have the incentive to fight against that, and you probably can't do that by brainwashing them because people have seen the violence. So the way you get around that is just by being less violent, being less punitive, because that is how you convince people that the state is not as bad as it could be. That is how you convince people that the propaganda is wrong. The next claim is people are too brainwashed from school and life at large, so they won't interact. This is untrue for a few reasons. Firstly, lots of citizens have a revealed preference to exit. The only response we get is this is a small amount of people. Yes, but that is some people who will obviously then be willing to accept this information. But secondly, that they see the hardships of everyday life. Their claim is your state is bad, but you don't know about the world around you. That is exactly our claim on side negative, that you should educate people of the world around you. You should have a South Korean state saying you are living in famine while we have excess of food available. You do not need to go hungry, your state is lying to you. That is the claim that we are making. Secondly, even if it is true that everyone is brainwashed, I'm not actually sure what the harm is. If we can give information to just 5% of people who want it, and all the brainwashed people just ignore it, surely that's fine. The only harm of that could accrue is opportunity cost, but I will deal with it and just lodge that at another point. The final piece of mitigation they give is what if people don't have USB readers or computers, which is again, obviously not the context of the debate. There are lots of possible information sources. A civil organization will not use something that people will not be able to access for that reason. So, finally, even if there is a risk of violence, we win because we give people agency. People have the right to access information. Yes, you maybe have to go up to the balloon, but that is a right that you have. You deserve to know what the state is doing. You deserve to know what is going on in the world around you. The next question I'll ask is this a poor use of capital? Because this is, I think, maybe where they're ahead in the debate. Their first claim is smuggling is dangerous and that lots of people die. Again, for I hope the final time, this is not what this debate is about. For the reasons that Affirmative identifies, yes, smuggling a single USB across the border is incredibly inefficient and dangerous. So that is not what these civil organizations do. If they choose to do it, it's probably because they know there is a secure way to do it, in which case we just activate the benefit of that. Secondly, there is now an enormous amount of backlash because no one knows where your money has gone. Secondly, the fact that it is happening now means that there is a real preference that people want this. Civil organizations would not spend money in this without talking to the donors and without talking to the patrons. So the fact that they have spent money on this indicates that people are happy to support it. But secondly, why is it that you don't know where your money goes? You can point to the installed speakers, you can point to the printed flyers and say these are going to North Korean people, and then show the image of the balloon above North Korea, spreading them out. So it's so unclear to me why you cannot educate people. Finally, I think we flip this. I think you can encourage more people to donate to our romantic mission of, reforming the North Korean state, to the mission of helping one North Korean person. I think that rhetorically, it's easy to be you can change the world rather than change just one individual's life. The alternatives that they mention are shockingly, underexplained. Firstly, they're you can rehome North Korean refugees, which is more important. Two responses to this. The first is that the state does this anyway. Look at all of their examples. They're we'll give them visas. That is not something a civil organization does, that is something that the state does. And the state has the incentive to look after these people when they go to their embassies, for all of the reasons they talk about. It's a massive public impetus to make sure that people can be rehomed, to make sure that people have the ability to access infrastructure and things like that. These people are massively sympathetic to the South Korean population. You do not need civil organizations to step in, the state will do it. Secondly, we explained in Hoyeon that the amount of people who do defect are incredibly small, so the amount of money that needs to go to this is not large. We can support both things, that's how debating works. They just have to support rehoming refugees. We suggest that they probably have a huge waste of money under their side because they just are sitting waiting for people to come. At least we can use and access money far more efficiently. Their next thing is like, we'll lobby international governments, obviously not something civil organizations do. Then they're like, we'll create escape routes out of China, which is firstly massively expensive because China doesn't want you to, they are allies with North Korea, and secondly, also probably extremely dangerous. Our positive material is you can get information to people who deserve it, that they can do whatever they want with it, and that's their right, proud to negate.
Alright, thanks Third Neg for that speech. Now welcome negative reply. Do you consent to recording or not?
Their pivot at third about how you cannot kill everyone in a village or blow up a river was weird because that was never our burden. We win because they increase the amount of torture or crops being stolen. That doesn't give people hope or encourage revolution. It kills them. It plunges them into fear. It impoverishes them. That is the worst and most common harm in this debate. That is why we win. 3 things you all had to believe if they were able to win. Firstly, you had to believe that the civil organizations have the capacity to be able to do this effectively. Secondly, you had to believe that the people had the capacity or willingness to engage with this information. Thirdly, you had to believe that the impact of information existed and that that value outweighed any harms that they had to stand by in today's debate. Let's talk about capacity of civil organizations. They tell you a couple things, that rich South Koreans donate and that they're good at smuggling and have existing channels. On that first thing, that doesn't matter because it's unresponsive to why we told you people stop donating. With money can be used smarter. But on that second thing about they're good at smuggling, there's no reason why you believe this. These organizations are decentralized. We told you that right at first. That was framing that was never responded to. But most effectively, we were shadowboxing against them because they gave you no mechanisms to believe why these civil organizations had actually good channels. We told you that the North Koreans had capacity, they had incentive to stop this. They're a country with nukes. Clearly, they have the military powers to be able to shoot balloons or shoot and bomb loudspeakers that are blaring propaganda fighting stuff. Let's talk about the second thing, North Korean citizens' capacity to engage. We gave you 3 reasons why they didn't have that capacity. Firstly, comprehension. Secondly, fear. Thirdly, just the lack of technology. The responses were reliant on you believing curiosity outweighs fear. I know you guys are all smart, and I know you realize that knowing that people can get killed around you, that your child can be taken from you and held hostage over your head is far more than, look, a balloon. Look, they tell you that you can't just not engage and there's no inherent harm to it. But I argue that people won't just try to avoid it and shut their eyes, but they would actively act antagonistic to snitch on the people around them. It is a dog-eat-dog world under an autocracy. It's unclear why people would be responsive at all when they know that their lives hang in the balance. But even if that's not true, that's all reliant on characterization that they know the cult of personality is fake. Note that if you believe that the cult of personality is perceived to be fake amongst the citizens, you believe that this nerfs all their benefits because what value does this information have if they can't act on it? But we told you why that's not true. Reality may be perceivable, but people take trade-offs because, yes, people die, but the West hates you. South Korea is evil. They will all kill you. Never respond to that top-level framing. Fear happens when you kill one person, when you kill one South Korean, when you kill one mole, an inside source. That is a chilling effect that spreads. Unclear whether they're ever able to respond to that. But even if you believe all of this stuff about cult of personality, that was unresponsive to capacity. The fact that people don't really know how to read because they have very little education. What are they going to do when they get a USB? Fucking boot up their PC, their DVD player? Get real. Curiosity and plausible deniability, the fact they have a right. That doesn't work when North Korea is not a rational regime. When North Korea's citizens believe North Korea is someone who protects them. When they know that their child can be taken away from them and held over their head for their entire lives. But let's then talk about the impact of information. Even if you believe any of that shit gets engaged with, that it gets seen. I want to note firstly, Mannat brings up the issue of the quality of this information, the fact that there's an information asymmetry. How does South Korea know what's happening within North Korea to be able to give them effective ways to get out of North Korea? Unclear and very vague. But note that there are outcomes of catharsis. Things like, sense check. How does a balloon or loudspeaker get to the right person to give them catharsis to know that their relative is alive? But also, Mannat gives you a reason why our capacity to give catharsis is far better. far better. We gave you 3 harms that they never really respond to. Things like crackdown, because life can get worse. You can get raped and traumatized. You can have your child held hostage. You can get tortured. Don't buy the ridiculous flip that things can get better. That because these North Korean government is never at risk of revolution. They're never going to be nicer. The organizations get less affected. Because if you're donating money, you want to see returns on it. But note also, there are refugees that we can help. By their own analysis at first, they tell you people do descent. So when we're able to give them visas, when we're able to rehome them, we're able to give them safe passages out of China, into Japan, into Uzbekistan, I think that is a tangible benefit that we're able to claim, so I'm incredibly proud to affirm.
Alright, thanks affirmative reply for that. And everyone can vote. Across the floor, shake hands, and head outside. We'll be back with you with a decision in about 15 minutes. I'll do it in the usual structure. So general feedback, result, how we got to that result. So 2 bits of general feedback from the panel for this one. Firstly, I think this debate would have benefited from a little bit more specific detail over what this material that's being sent over actually looks like. Like, what specifically, what information are these citizens going to be receiving? Is it attacks on the regime? Is it depictions of the outside world? Is it potential things like escape routes? I think because at times teams allude to like, these organizations know what's best, but it's like, okay, but we on the panel don't really know what's best. So I think more detail there would have clarified that a bit. Secondly, I think in a debate that was this heavy on mitigation from both teams, there needed to be a lot more direct and explicit weighing of material to explain why, even in worst cases, impacts are still able to weigh out and carry the debate overall. So, in terms of the result, we came to a unanimous decision. We awarded this debate by a close margin to the affirmative team. Congratulations, commiserations. We did that based on 3 questions. Firstly, how many North Korean citizens are going to be able to access this information? Secondly, what does this information do for North Korean citizens? And lastly, what is the impact on South Korean citizens and NGOs? So, on the first question about how many North Koreans are able to access this information, there are 2 subclashes. The first is how effective are these organizations? The affirmative team try to characterize them as ineffective because they're decentralized, small, not well funded, in opposition to the South Korean government, and suggest that their tactics like speakers and balloons don't reach that many people. Smuggling is risky and expensive. I think the negative team gives some reasonable countervailing reasons to this, pointing out that these are empirically the status quo. They are relatively well funded. These organizations are on the ground and have the most proximity to and the best sort of incentive and capacity to be able to use relatively effective tactics to inform people in North Korea and not spend their money in stupid ways that it's going to be quite wasteful. I think secondly, they're also able to point out that their burden in this debate is pretty reasonably not to reach every single North Korean citizen, so they're still able to claim benefits insofar as they reach some people, which is why that first push about NGOs we don't really buy the claims out of the affirmative team. We think the negative team do have some reasonable capacity there. The second subclash is a little bit more important though, which is how effective is the North Korean regime at suppressing this material? Because the affirmative team gives some good characterization here, explaining that the North Korean regime is a heavily militarized state with a very strong security regime. It's had lots of experience dealing with things like balloons and it has therefore a capacity to be able to track them and also to crack down on civilians to make sure that this information is not disseminated widely among the population. The negative team do point out some holes in this, suggesting that this regime can't block all balloons, it can't do much about speakers on the South Korean side of the border, which is true, but I think largely functions as mitigation. I think it's true that the negative team is able to point out that the regime isn't able to stop all information from getting into North Korea. However, I do think that the negative team is less effective at proving that the North Korean regime would not be particularly effective at cracking down on it once it has arrived in North Korea, which is where the affirmative team is able to establish some benefits. The other claim that the negative team make here is that this might divert resources from oppression if the regime has to do things like track balloons instead, for example. The reason we didn't really credit this push is that firstly, it was sort of unclear that it was true that that this would actually be not targeting people, because as the affirmative team characterised, suppressing information often means suppressing the people with that information. And secondly, I think third affirmative points out that it's likely that this money is going to be diverted not from the security state and oppressive systems, but rather other things like subsidies to farmers or the healthcare system, because of the incentives of the regime, which I don't think are really challenged by the negative team in this debate. So, at the end of that first clash, I think it's true that these NGOs would be able to get some information into North Korea. It's unclear how effectively it's able to spread once it is in North Korea. The second question, what does this information actually do once citizens have access to it? The negative team's big claim here is that this gives citizens the benefit of choice and agency, and they can choose to use that information in ways of their own choosing. And using this better understanding of why North Korea sucks, why the outside world is significantly better, this might translate to things like slowing down their work or not snitching on people, and sort of little acts of defiance that make it life a little bit better for these people, that maybe destabilize the North Korean regime to some extent. I think there are 4 direct responses from the affirmative team that are relatively effective here. The first is to point out in terms of characterization that there are lots of reasons that this propaganda may not actually be believed that much by North Korean citizens in the first place because of factors like limited education, the fact that they've been heavily propagandized within society. It's including things like a distrust of South Korean information and the West more broadly, which suggests that there are some people, even if they do receive this information, who are unlikely to believe it and act upon it. Secondly, I think the affirmative team point out that if it is true, as sort of both teams characterize, that life in North Korea is quite miserable and most citizens are already not particularly enamored with the regime, even if the affirmative team is right that a lack of info is what holds back people rather than brainwashing, it's unclear the extent to which there is an actual marginal change in this debate if people get this outside information, because it just tells them, it just kind of confirms what they already know about why their life is bad and that they're being lied to. It's unclear what that actually tangibly changes for their lives. Thirdly, I think the affirmative team is able to point out that the overwhelming incentive of North Korean citizens is one that is driven more by fear than by curiosity and hope. They are likely to try and avoid being, involving themselves with this because of the immense amount of things like paranoia in North Korean society, the incentive of other people in society, like supervisors, for example, to report you so that they're not the ones that get left holding the bag and getting punished, means that it's unlikely that people are going to be wanting to engage with this and using this information even though the negative team point out ways that you could sort of like quiet quit almost and like quietly resist the regime. It's unclear that people are going to be willing to take that risk, even if it is a relatively low risk as characterized. And fourthly, that's kind of the same as the second one. Even if it was true that lots of people sort of became less efficient at their jobs, it was kind of unclear the extent to which that was a harm that would meaningfully destabilize the regime, that would meaningfully improve the lives of North Korean citizens, which is why it was difficult to credit that impact significantly in the debate. What did the affirmative team tell us about the tangible impact for North Korean citizens? They'd say that this is the primary outcome of this. It will be inspiring regime crackdowns, that the regime currently doesn't have this incentive because it doesn't feel threatened by citizens and has other countervailing incentives like wanting them to be economically productive. But when they start engaging in things like propaganda, there is more risk of dissent, and they're therefore likely to do things like crackdowns and use fear tactics to try and stop that. The negative team's main line of response to this is to say that this is unlikely because, firstly, the regime has incentives not to kill people on a mass scale. I think that's true, and I think that beats some of the more exaggerated claims out of the affirmative, but I do think the affirmative is reasonable to point out that individual cases are still likely to be used as an example to spread fear, to reinforce state control. And the second line of response for the negative team is about plausible deniability, saying that citizens, just because they have access, if a balloon lands in their yard, they're not going to get killed by the regime for no reason. I think the affirmative team responded to this in two ways. Firstly, pointing out that plausible deniability is unlikely to be actually able to be invoked in a lot of cases, because it's like if you're in possession of a balloon or a USB or this material, it's unlikely that actually is something you can plausibly deny, because you did choose to keep it at some stage and get caught with it in a worst case scenario. But secondly, and I think more importantly, they just point out that the North Korean regime really doesn't care about plausible deniability. It doesn't have a Western legal system or these norms. It's more incentivized to use fear to crack down, and points to empirical examples of North Korea doing so in the past, which suggests to the panel that it's more likely they would engage in that path rather than the one characterized by the negative team. I also think in terms of rebuttal, the affirmative team point out that a fairly large portion of the negative team's benefits are contingent on North Korean citizens being both willing to access this information and willing to act on it in ways that I don't think the negative team is able to sufficiently prove in the context of the debate. So weighing that issue up at the end, it was unclear, given that a lot of these benefits were contingent, the importance or meaning of agency in this debate that was relied on by the negative team was actually able to be acted on given the social and physical constraints explained by the affirmative team, which is why their risk of physical harm, even if that risk was relatively low and mitigated by the negative team, was more concrete, more tangible, and more effectively weighed in the debate by the panel, which is why they went on that clash. Lastly, very briefly on the impact on South Korean citizens and non-government organisations, the affirmative team make an argument that there's an opportunity cost because it's an ineffective use of money. It delegitimizes these organisations. I'd note this was largely contingent on the first clash about NGOs and how effective they are, which I think the negative team is able to prove. They are relatively effective. They do have reasonable amounts of support, so they probably will still have reasonable amounts of money. I think secondly, the negative team also point out that it's not mutually exclusive. Like they can also use money to support North Korean defectors, so they're able to co-opt a reasonable amount of those benefits. And I think the negative team is able to establish that they do establish some concrete benefits in terms of things like catharsis for former North Korean defectors who are able to get a benefit. Even though the affirmative team trying to co-opt this by saying you can also get catharsis in other methods, it was unclear the extent to which there was actually a meaningful opportunity cost and trade-off. So the negative team do establish a win there, but it's just relatively less important in this debate than the impact on North Korean citizens, which both sides would agree were a more vulnerable and relevant stakeholder in the debate. So that's how we saw the debate and why we awarded to the affirmative. Hope that made sense. Feel free to come to any of us with questions or individual feedback, and good luck for the silent round.
Thank you.